General purpose rifle optics, offset iron sights, and accounting for wind when zeroing. This week on Mail Call Mondays. Mail Call Mondays is brought to you by Modular Driven Technologies. If you need a chassis system for your precision rifle, check out mdttac.com. I'm John McQuay with 8541 Tactical, and this is Mail Call Mondays, the show that answers your questions about precision rifles, optics, and equipment. Welcome to another Mail Call Mondays, and this Monday our first question comes from Benjamin, and Benjamin asks, for a general purpose carbine, would you recommend a low power variable optic, i.e. 1 to 4, 1 to 6, or 1 to 8? If so, what attributes would you consider mandatory? What features would be nice to have but not mandatory? And last, what optics would you recommend? Well, Benjamin, there is really a ton of options for what I would put on a general purpose carbine in a variety of different price ranges. And I kind of grabbed two that are on varying different ends of the spectrum. Now, on a carbine like the one I have in front of me, this is kind of what I would consider a general purpose truck gun type carbine. It is a 14.5-inch pencil barrel on it, so it's really light. I've got a Fortis switch handguard over it, and just the end of the flash hider is sticking out here. This is a Faxon Firearms lightweight barrel with a permanently attached flash hider, so it is a 16-inch overall barrel, but it is pretty much the shortest configuration you can get without having to register it as a short barrel rifle. And we do have the MagneoSpeed grip on this rifle and a just regular Magpul collapsible stock. Overall, this is a pretty lightweight system. I've got an Enforce light on here, so I can get some decent target identification in low light situations. And so I really thought about what optic I would want to put on this rifle to maximize its capabilities. A 14.5-inch barrel is able to reach out, well beyond 300 yards and still actually have some effects on target. So I wanted to be able to reach out, but more importantly, identify what I was shooting at that distance. And while I can hit steel gongs with a 1-power dot sight all day long at 300, it is much easier to actually see what you're shooting at with a low power variable. And what I've got on here is a Bushnell 1 to 4 PCL throwdown. We have done a review on this optic before, and I will post a link to that so you guys can check it out. And it is a really great option in that sub $200 price point. Since it is a 1 to 4 power variable, if you are dealing with stuff close up, like say you needed to clear a house or something of that nature, or you were dealing with dangerous game with it, then you can keep it on 1 power and you can have a really fast optic. The reticle in here is a horseshoe dot type reticle, so when you turn on the illumination at 1 power, it really acts like a coarse dot sight. If you want a little bit finer aiming, there is a dot in the center that you can concentrate, but it's a great option for fast, and it is almost a true 1 power. It's so close that it's very hard to notice, and a real simple way to tell if a sight is close to 1 power is if it's able to focus on things that are close up here. So when I look through this optic, I can actually clearly see the back of the Enforce light up here. So if I wanted to, if I was somehow able to get the rear sight in a correct position behind here, I more than likely could actually sight through this optic when it's dialed at 1 power. That really isn't necessary since this is not a full electrical sight, meaning if I pull the battery out of here, I still have a glass etched reticle in here that I can utilize, so a battery failure is not going to take the optic out of commission. So at 1 power, I really have a decent field of view. I can really get the optic up quick. I can engage whatever I need to do at close range. Now, if I want a little bit more magnification, I do have a throw lever here that I can flip out, and then I can crank it over to 4 power really quickly. If I don't want to go to the trouble of cranking the lever out, then it just does make a really nice purchase to roll with your thumb. So I can get it up to 4 power really quick and identify those targets and be good to go. 4 power, I think, is a really good option on a rifle like this because it allows your optic to stay in that lighter weight area. When you talk about small objectives, when you start to get into bigger power with small objectives, then you start to lose that light transmission. If you start to raise that magnification, you really need to start to open up that objective to be able to still get good light transmission. And with a general purpose carbine, I still want to be able to utilize it in low light very well. So this is the optic that stays on this rifle for the most part. I have more expensive options hanging around, but this keeps this rifle lightweight. It keeps it easy to handle, and I don't have to mess with flipping a magnifier in and out of the way. I usually find that when you start to pair dot sights with magnifiers, things get a whole lot more complex. You make too many compromises, and it's just a huge pain in the butt. So I really prefer variable magnification optics over a dot sight and a magnifier. So at $186, I think this is a really good option. Now, things I like about it is the illumination over here on the side is really easy to get on. It's really easy to dial in for a variety of different conditions. And Bushnell did a great job on this scope of making sure that the brightness setting is varied enough that actually turning the brightness turret will get you a variety of different settings usable in different situations. All too often we see on cheaper scopes, one setting will be too dim and the next setting will just be way too bright. And this is bright enough that the illumination is daylight viewable. I don't know really why you would use it in daylight. Since it's a glass etched reticle, what you'll generally find is you can set the power to a point where it would work inside in the shade in the dark, and then when you're outside and it's too bright, you just have a black aiming point instead of an illuminated aiming point, and that seems to work just fine for me. But if you want to crank that illumination up during the day, you can do that. The turrets are not my favorite thing on here. There is a little bit of lash in the turrets. They are exposed turrets, so when you zero them, you are going to want to reset it to 0, and you are going to want to check those periodically when you deploy the rifle to make sure that it is on 0. They are not locking, so there is a possibility to roll them on gear, roll them on a bag or something, and get them bumped off of 0. That's just something that kind of comes with the ability to use this in quite a few different situations. Because they are exposed turrets, if you do find yourself requiring more precision at longer range, you can tape a dope card on here and you can dial for whatever range you want. So if you were using this on, say, a 308, where those sight adjustments for the intermediate range may be a little bit more important, then you do have the ability to dial up here. What I really prefer to see on an optic like this is some kind of locking turrets, or just go with full-on capped turrets. Because this does have a ballistic reticle in it, I can utilize that reticle for holdovers and I don't really need to dial, so a capped turret would work better with the simplicity and speed that I'm going for with this system here. Now, if we jump up to the extreme opposite end of the price range, we come to something like the Bushnell SMR-S. This is a 1 to 8.5 variable dot sight. We spoke before on the PCL Throwdown with its exposed turrets. This also has exposed turrets, but these are locking turrets. So you pull up to disengage them, dial them to where you want to be, and then push down to lock them down. This is a 34 millimeter tube, whereas the PCL Throwdown is a 30 millimeter tube. So 34 millimeter tube puts you into larger lenses in here, larger assemblies, larger mounting system, so everything bumps up a little bit, and you end up with a larger overall weight. Now the optic does feel a little bit higher quality, but you're talking about a $1,700 price point for this optic. You do get a wider range of adjustment, you do get more distinct clicks, you do get a really good mill-based reticle in this. It's still a horseshoe style reticle, and you still do have really nice illumination on this. The drawback on the SMR-S is when you crank this guy down to 1 power, there is a little bit more distortion around the edges, so it does not feel like a true 1 power. Now, one of the advantages is the larger tube, larger lenses, and better light transmission of the SMRS gives you a more open field of view. It's kind of really difficult to describe it until you get behind the optic, but it feels like you can see so much more through this optic at 1 power than you can at the smaller the smaller optic at the same magnification level. It's kind of that difference between looking through a toilet paper tube and then removing the toilet paper tube and just looking with your plain eyes. You just have a more open field of view with this 34mm tube. But again, you pay a price penalty and a weight penalty for this, but you gain a little bit more in durability as well. You don't have the nice throw lever. You need to put a cattail on this. The magnification ring is a little bit more difficult to turn, so you're not going to snap it quickly back and forth between 1 power and high power. The benefit is, though, here we do have 8.5 for the top magnification, and that 8.5 is really good if you're in a situation, say for instance a law enforcement sniper or a law enforcement designated marksman, where target identification is critical. There, that 8.5 is an absolutely wonderful thing to have because you can really get in, you can see what's in hands, you can identify faces, and very often in law enforcement situations, not only can you identify the face, you can start looking at those facial features and you can read what's going on much better through a higher magnification optic than you can through a 4-power optic. So those are the benefits, but as I mentioned, on a lightweight carbine like this, this 1 to 8.5 power scope just really makes this thing top heavy, and it doesn't handle as well close in. So you have to kind of decide where you want to put that focus on. If I lived in a large open area and I was going to strap this thing on my horse and go out and ride the property line, then I might want a higher magnification scope so I can zoom in, I can identify things, I can really see what that is that I'm preparing to shoot. So again, it just depends upon what your price point is and what your main focus is for the optic itself. So I hope that gives you a little bit of insight. I really like cap turrets. I like things that are locked down. For a carbine where I'm not going to do a lot of dialing, I'm not going to do a lot of extended range shooting, I really like to be able to set it and forget it. To zero the rifle, I want to be able to throw it in the back of the car, throw it in the trunk, and just forget about it and let it bounce around in there, and when I need it, grab it and it's ready to go. So that is one drawback to exposed turrets. That is one benefit to locking or cap turrets. And both of these optics are first focal plane reticles. That's one thing I failed to mention. I really, especially if there's any kind of ballistic detail to the reticle, I really like that first focal plane optic. With both of these optics, what that allows me to do is at 1 power, that reticle shrinks down and the horseshoe style reticle just acts like a coarse dot. When I need to be able to identify the target, or I'm going to do holdovers, or I'm going to engage a target at longer range, then dialing that magnification up brings the reticle out, gives me all the detail in the reticle, and makes those hold points very usable when you're at 4 or at 8.5 power magnification. So I do like a first focal plane reticle in these, although again you're going to bump up that price point a little bit to get the first focal plane reticle versus a second focal plane reticle. And if there's no detail in it, if it's just a standard dot and stick type reticle or a horseshoe type reticle, then the second focal plane reticle is really not that big of a deal. So I hope that gives you some ideas on what I look for in those type of systems, and something that'll help you in your quest to find a good general purpose carbine optic. Our next question comes from David, and David asks, okay, here's another one. Offset irons, offset red dot sight, or just turning the optic on top down to the lowest power and running it that way, similar to an ACOG on a 308 gas gun. Well, David, again, we come back to that. It depends. What are you using the optic for? If you're going to shoot in a 3-gun type situation and the class allows an offset red dot sight, I think that is probably going to be your best bet. Run a low magnification optic on top and then put an offset 45-degree red dot sight on the rifle so you can hit those long range targets and then just rock the gun in and then drop down and get that red dot sight for the close range stuff. That really is going to be your fastest method of engagement, and that's really why you'll see a lot of the top guys in 3-gun running those offset 45-degree red dot sights. Now, if you are utilizing that 45-degree sight for your backup in addition to a magnified optic, then I would say you might want to go for the iron sights. Something that is either fixed or something that is a very rugged 45-degree flip-up sight. That way you don't have to worry about an extra set of batteries. You don't have to worry about an extra set of lenses. The worst comes to worst, if you drop it in the mud, get it really nasty, then you can just smudge off the sights real quick so you get a sight picture through them and then go. So if it's going to be a bang-around rifle, if it's not a competition rifle, then the iron sights may offer you a little bit higher degree of durability. Now, if you wanted to go to the top tier and you wanted to put something like a Trijicon RMR on here and then cover it with some kind of rubberized dust cover, there are quite a few different options out there, then that's going to be pretty rugged, but again, it's another set of batteries that you have to keep up with. So there are some considerations there. Now, depending upon what your magnified optic is on top, running it at the lowest magnification and just gassing on may be an option. The optic I have here is a Leupold 3-9 VXR Patrol, and it has the TMR Fire Dot reticle in it. Now, the really cool thing with the TMR Fire Dot is it is a TMR style reticle, so you do have mil hashes in it, but just the center of the reticle is illuminated by a dot, and the intensity is variable by a button on the side of here. It does have a motion control in it, so if you leave the dot on, it'll go to sleep. When you leave it alone, when you pick it up, the dot comes on. With that dot powered on, you do have the ability to flip up the rear scope cap, leave the front cap down, and sight through it and just use that dot with both eyes open as a coarse aiming point. Now, I do say coarse aiming point because this optic is not designed to do that. It is not parallax free, so there's going to be a little bit of parallax induced when you do that, but it is a down and dirty occluded eye gun sight, or OEG. Those are the OG red dot sights for those of you guys that know any Vietnam history or anything about the history of red dot sights. Back in the old days, they had occluded eye gun sights where you couldn't actually see through the sight, but the sight gave you an aiming point, and then you used your non-shooting eye to see the target, and your brain superimposes those two pictures over each other. And that's the same thing that you can do with just leaving your objective cap closed and looking through the eyepiece with an illuminated reticle. It's not the greatest. I definitely recommend that you try this out on the range at close ranges at home before you decide to utilize it for any specific purpose out in the real world. But if you have a magnified optic like a 3-9 that is not going to work very well up close, then shooting both eyes open works well. Now, you can still do that with both caps open, just there's a lot of extra clutter in the sight picture that your brain has to work through, and I prefer to do it with one cap closed if I can. Running a magnified optic like this on 3 power for close range shooting can be done, but it's a lot slower, and once you start to get inside 25 yards, then it is really difficult, because more than likely your optic is not going to focus on the target, and it's going to be very distracting because your eyes are going to try to focus on the target, and your aiming point in your reticle is going to blur out pretty significantly. So go to the range and try it out, but I think you'll see quickly that that's very difficult to do at close range with the caps open. So those are some options. I definitely, if if money was not an object and I wanted to be as fast as I could possibly be, then a magnified optic, appropriate for the longest target engagement I'm going to do on the top of the rifle at 12 o'clock, and a mini red dot sight like an ACOT, or I'm sorry, like a RMR on the 45-degree axis is what I would choose. That's going to be the quickest, but that's probably also going to be your most expensive, and you're going to have to maintain those batteries. So that's just my opinion. Now, if you guys are running dual sighting systems on your rifles, I'd really like to hear what you're running and how well it's worked for you. Do you prefer the red dot? Do you prefer the irons? Or are you just using an occluded eye method and rolling with your regular magnified optic on top? So please drop me a comment down below. And our last question comes from Hector, and Hector asks, when sighting in a rifle at 100 yards, does wind really affect your point of impact at 100 yards? How much wind is too much when trying to sight in? Well, Hector, I see this stuff all the time, and I'm sure you have too, when you go to the range and you watch guys that are shooting their rifles at 100 yards and they're not grouping well and they're going, oh, that wind, the wind got me. Well, at 100 yards, the wind is not doing a whole lot. Now, if you are trying to zero your long-range precision rifle and you're not accounting for wind when you do that zero, then it may cause you some issues at longer range. But if you grab your ballistic calculator and you start going through and you start looking at what the effects are of wind at 100 yards, you'll notice that even a 10-mile-an-hour wind, if we take a slow 308 or we take a 223, something in that nature, you're usually within 1 to 2/10 of a mil of windage at 100 yards. So if you have a full value 10-mile-an-hour wind blowing, 2/10 is generally going to be your worst case scenario. And 2/10 equates to about 3/4 of an inch at 100 yards. So if your rifle is grouping sub MOA, if you can shoot a 1/4 inch group with that rifle, then you really need to start worrying about that if you are having a full value 10-mile-an-hour wind. Now, if it's not a full value 10-mile-an-hour wind, if it's what we normally have, like a 3 to 5 mile an hour gusting, something like that, then it's probably doing very little at all over the course of a 5-shot group. And that's why I do recommend shooting a 5-shot group to verify your zero. Maybe not necessarily to get your zero on, but to verify the zero, shoot a 5-shot group. It will be a whole lot cheaper to shoot that 5 shots than it will to waste ammo at 800 or 900 yards hitting to the sides of the target. But check your ballistic computer, see what the wind is actually doing. If you have a wind meter, then bust out your wind meter and get a good idea of actually what the wind is doing. If the wind is not blowing steadily and you are not getting a 10 mile an hour or higher, then really don't worry about it. More than likely your shooting position, your breathing, and your ability to squeeze the trigger is going to have a greater effect on the movement of that shot group than what the wind is doing. And if it really bothers you, if you're really concerned about it, then once you get your elevation zeroed, bring the target into 50 or 25 yards and shoot a group at 50 or 25 to make sure you have that zero or that windage zeroed out. Me personally, again, unless I have a sustained wind above 10 miles an hour, I'm not generally going to worry about it when I'm zeroing the rifle, especially when we get into 243s and 6.5s and some of the wind cheaters. Those generally have very, very little effect at 100 yards. So that's my opinion on the matter. I really would like to hear you guys that are in windier areas of the country. Are you worrying about wind when you zero? Are you getting sustained winds above 10 miles an hour when you go out to zero your rifle at 100 yards? Generally, where I shoot at, we have a fairly well protected range from the winds, and at 100 it's just really not that big of a deal for us. So that's my opinion on it. Make sure you bust out your ballistic calculator though and actually see what your bullet at your velocity is doing, but I think you'll find it'll be within that 1 to 2/10 at 100 yards. One last thing I want to talk about before we go is on Facebook. For those of you that are on Facebook, we just recently started a new Facebook group. It is the 8541 Tactical Shooters group. Now, you don't have to be a tactical shooter. You don't have to be an 8541 or anything of the nature. You just have to be a firearms enthusiast. It is a closed group, so you do have to go click that you want membership to the group, and then one of the moderators will grant membership to the group, but it's not some super secret elite group. We just did that to try to get ahead of some of the problems that some other firearms groups on Facebook have. So it's just generally a place to discuss precision rifles and firearms in general. If you guys want to check it out, we would be happy to have you. And again, I will leave that link down below. That is it for this Mail Call Mondays. If you guys have any questions or comments on anything that we've covered, please leave them in the comments section below. If you're listening to this on your favorite podcast, then you can send us questions at 8541tactical@gmail.com. If you like the video, please make sure you like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, get out and shoot.